I am so excited for you because today you get the privilege and the honor from hearing from an expert in the PR industry. I have with me today a woman that has spent 25 years in the industry. She's worked for CNN. She has done many amazing and wonderful things helping entrepreneurs all over the country to monetize their content. She is a mother, she is a wife, and she is a straight up awesome lady. Please help me in welcoming Miss Elizabeth Howell of Howell Media. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Roger. How are you?
I am phenomenal. I'm excellent. Better now that I'm talking to you. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I'm dying to know. Tell me a little bit about your background. How'd you get here?
Sure.
What's your story?
Well, I have been successfully unemployed for about 11 years. Took a time out during that period, and I'm back at it and doing something new. Now I am helping authors, entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, coaches, consultants, helping them get access to the best organic marketing levers that are out there. And in my experience, that really is podcast guesting and targeted media interviews. Those are great ways to get exposure.
Wow. Wow. So tell us, you spend a lot of time in the industry. What makes you qualified to help entrepreneurs? What makes you a reputable source in this industry?
Well, that's a great question, Roger. And I'm really glad that you said it that way because anyone who is hiring PR help needs to ask that question because there are a lot of people who do PR and there are not a ton of people who are great at it. And I really believe that the reason for that is that you have to have worked in a newsroom or at least been exposed to a newsroom to really understand what a journalist's job is, what it entails, how they operate in a deadline environment, what makes a compelling news story. And I was very fortunate that my first big girl job was at CNN a long time ago when they were the only 24-hour news network. And I worked in the PR department. So it was my job to get media coverage for the media, which is fairly meta. And I didn't realize or appreciate how unique that situation was until much later in my career, because I just assumed that everybody knew what I knew. But as I moved on in my career and I did other PR, jobs, I learned that the ability that I had to understand the needs of a journalist really put me in a whole different class of PR people. And I could provide success and results that other people couldn't because I knew what made a story and what did not.
Wow.
And a lot of PR people, unfortunately, especially in corporate, are in the position of being handed something saying, promote this, get media coverage for this. And it may be, that somebody won an award or we have a new product. And unfortunately, journalists don't necessarily care about that.
Really? Wow.
That's true because they want a story. A story has a beginning, middle, and end. There's usually a hero. There's usually a villain. If anyone's familiar with the story brand model, that's been a great way to learn about what are the different elements of a story that you really need to have. And that is so true for anything in the journalism space. Even if you're talking about local TV, if you're talking about newsletters, which are super popular today, podcasts, obviously, but there has to be a story to it.
Wow, that is phenomenal.
Yeah.
So, walk us back through those years at CNN.
Sure.
What exactly did you do while you were there? What were some of the nitty-gritty granular details that helped you to develop the skill set that you have today?
Well, that's a great question. And you never knew what you were going to get when you walked in the building. So every day was very different. There could be actors and actresses in the building. There could be politicians. There could be world leaders. You might run into Ted Turner frantically trying to open a door that had a keypad and it was locked and he couldn't get through because there was always construction going on. One day I showed up at work and I wasn't super dressed up. And unfortunately, that was the day I had to give a tour to the president of Ireland, who was a woman.
Wow.
And I didn't love what I was wearing that day, which was a bummer, but it was a phenomenal experience.
Wow.
And getting to show her around a place that I was super proud of was definitely a career milestone for me. But I met a ton of people who, to me, were amazing. I mean, I got to meet Muhammad Ali. I got to meet Rosa Parks. I got to meet, a few presidents, a few first ladies.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was just every day was totally different. And I saw some unbelievable people.
Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah.
And, we were talking a little bit before the show, and you were sharing with me that you had the opportunity to learn from someone. I believe you said their name was Emily Post.
Yes.
Can you walk me through that?
Sure. So I moved to Vermont after I left CNN and I worked for an ad agency. And that was a great pit stop because I worked with some financial institutions, I worked for some tech companies, I did ghostwriting for several CEOs in those industries. So that was really helpful in just building those muscles and some of the other areas of PR that I had not been exposed to, like speech writing and shareholder letters and all those kinds of corporate communication things that we all need to use or, that companies need to produce. And my boss had not told me this, but he was related to Emily Post, who many people might remember as the woman who wrote the original etiquette book about manners.
Wow.
Yes. And so
Wow.
I didn't realize it, but I was working for her grandson. And about that same time, his mother had retired from the Emily Post duties and passed it on to her daughter in law, Peggy Post. And they had watched me work, apparently, for several years. And they asked me to take over the PR for Peggy, who was just starting out. She had a phenomenal business resume. She had been one of the first women trainees at Chemical Bank back in the 70s. She had been an international flight attendant for Pan Am, so she'd been around the world many times. She had a really great corporate background, but she needed to be sort of taught how to be a public figure and how to do media interviews. So that was my job.
Wow, that is wonderful.
Yeah.
So how did that morph into you starting Howell Media?
That's a great question. I would say that I had to be scrappy because we did not have a marketing budget. So we pretty much depended on the PR to get us new business. And that was probably my most entrepreneurial experience. I very much liked the idea. I actually left CNN because we wanted to move and buy a house and start a family. But the other part of it was that I really did not like the corporate structure. And CNN was not very corporate. Let me be real clear about that. But it was part of a larger corporate organization. And I didn't like the fact that there wasn't a lot of accountability. And when I moved to Vermont, I worked at an ad agency. You had billable hours, you had to track your times. That was like the ultimate accountability. And the great thing about it, it's a pain in the butt, of course, but it teaches you to manage your time like nothing else. So, and I liked the fact that it was very black and white. Had I done work that was worth doing, did I have enough billable hours? And not everyone loves that structure, and I'm glad I'm not doing it anymore, but it definitely made me look at my time in a new way. And that was such a good thing to learn at that point in my career.
Wow, that is wonderful. So let me ask you this, as it relates to PR,
Yes.
right? As an entrepreneur, as someone who's still currently employed at this moment, who I aspire to be successfully unemployed as soon as humanly possible, right? But as someone who's taken that step into entrepreneurship, right? How important is it to really have PR? How important is it to have someone that understands the background? Why can't I just go out and just, post some stuff and, really hope that someone comes and sees it?
Well, you certainly can try that approach. Good luck. And then call me and we can talk about getting more serious. But, it's hard. I'm in that's the same position right now, trying to find clients. And there's so many things. The great thing about today is there's so many things you can do that it's sometimes difficult to make the decision about what you should do. And you really have to start with your goals. And sometimes when you're just starting out as an entrepreneur, you don't even know what that might be.
Right.
But maybe there's a number that you're trying to reach. If you're coaching, maybe you want to have, 12 clients. Maybe if you have a newsletter, you want 1,000 subscribers. Whatever that goal is that you're going for, you want to kind of work backwards to see, how do I get there? And what are the best marketing channels for me to accomplish that goal? Because you can be writing great content on LinkedIn, you can be posting on Instagram or Facebook, you can send out a newsletter, you can do email marketing. But if it's not coordinated, if it's not organized, if there's not, a process that you're following to get to a specific end result, you're wasting your time. And as an entrepreneur, that's one thing you cannot afford to waste, your time.
Wow.
And if you do media interviews and you do podcast guesting, it's an opportunity to have a conversation with your target audience. If you can dial in and say, who is my target audience? Where are they hanging out? And there's so many podcasts, there's a lot of niche podcasts. So if you can find a podcast that's targeted to your customer, it's a great way to get in front of them, to have a conversation that's longer than 5 minutes so that you can show them that you know what you're doing and that you know how to help them achieve their own goal.
Wow, that is phenomenal. And I love how you shared that because, it's so difficult as an entrepreneur to manage your time and manage all these things. And a good friend of mine said, Adam Carroll, he said that just because you can build a house doesn't mean that you should. And you've obviously written the book on PR, and your experience and your knowledge far surpasses something that I could do on my own, right? So let's say that, I was like, okay, I'm ready to start working with you. I'm ready to, hire your firm to help me to be able to get in front of the right people, where would we start? What would that look like?
That's a great question. And it's a good question to ask in the beginning. We would talk about your goals, just like I said before, and we would look at what do those metrics look like. So how many clients do you need to be successful? And where are those people hanging out? Let's say it's architects, just to, be specific. Is there a Facebook group where they hang out? Are there podcasts that they listen to? Is there a reporter somewhere who covers the architecture space for, say commercial buildings or, a certain type of home? Where are people who need that service? Where are they hanging out? What kind of media do they consume? Are there newsletters that are written about that topic? And I would take that my approach would be to find those places. And luckily, new media is coming up every day. There's so many things out there, but I have a lot of good resources to be able to sort of dial in and say, oh, look, here's this reporter. He's been covering this space for a really long time. Let's talk to him. And maybe he can't do a story on you today, but let's stay in touch with him and let's make sure that, you're writing comments on his stories and letting him know who you are. A lot of it is not that dissimilar to the sales effort. People will say things like, well, I've contacted 10 podcasts and I haven't heard back from any of them. I give up. This podcast guesting thing isn't going to work for me. Okay, well, how many phone calls do you have to make to make a sale? If you have a $10,000 coaching program, do 3 of 10 people purchase? I'm guessing not. So don't be discouraged if you are not getting the results that you want right away. But, to get back to your question, Roger, is that you find those outlets that match the niche that you're in. And then you figure out a way to get in front of those people. So, hopefully it's an article in a newsletter. Maybe you could write a piece that gets put into a newspaper or a magazine where your clients or your ideal audience is reading. The podcast guesting space to me is the first place to go because there's so much opportunity there. And the thing that's so great about podcasts is it's a conversation. It's not a 3-minute TV piece, for example, where highly scripted, you talk to the producer ahead of time, the questions you're going to get asked. And you may not even have an opportunity to get in a lot of detail about what you do. But if you're on a podcast, there's back and forth. If it is a targeted audience, you can walk them through some of the typical challenges that they might face and how you approach creating a solution for them. And that allows someone to think about, okay, gee, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way before. That would help me. And you've already provided value to someone before they even raise their hand to say, I'm interested in learning more about what you do. And the other great thing about podcasts that's pretty unique in the space is that you can leave a resource behind. You can work with the host to say, I have this worksheet that is really helpful to people who are in this position or who are just trying to learn about this or who have this advanced problem that I'm really good at solving. I would love to leave this for your audience. And that gives you a way to have them come to a website and collect that resource, but they have to give you their email address because building an email address or a list of emails is the most important thing an entrepreneur needs to do because LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, you don't own those platforms. And even YouTube, as great as it is, does not give you a way to reach out to those folks one-on-one. So it's really important to capture email addresses, and podcasts give you that opportunity.
Wow, that is phenomenal. I'm going to go back to this podcast and seriously listen to it and take some notes because there's so much value in what you just said. And, I would just love it if we could just shift for a few minutes. Tell us a little bit more about, being a mom, being a wife, and how that played into you becoming successfully unemployed, and how someone that's out there as a mother, as a wife, how could they manage some of these challenges while building a very successful business like you have?
I love that question, Roger. That's something that I learned when I worked at CNN. I had a really great friend and she had a baby really young. She got married, she had a baby right away, and she had to navigate maternity leave at a corporation in 1997. And that was a totally different world. Maternity leaves didn't exist. And she was a breastfeeding mom and there was no breastfeeding room at CNN. And when she came back, one of the things I helped her do was write a letter to the HR director asking if we could create a lactation room. And we did. So very early on in my career, I saw those challenges really up close and personal. And that really impacted me. And so I knew that when I had a kid, I wanted to be flexible. I wanted to have the flexibility to do what I needed to do. And I had no idea how motherhood would impact me. And I knew I would still want to work. So, that's tough. It's a tough thing to navigate. And if you're an entrepreneur on top of that, that's a lot.
Wow.
And interestingly, I have two kids. I have a daughter, Samantha, and a son, Ethan.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
Yes. And when they were younger, we did the daycare thing and it was hard, but it worked. I worked from home on Fridays and that made life a lot easier. But as they got older, when Ethan was, 12, 13, that's when it got harder for me to be missing things. And he was smart enough to say to me one day, Mom, can we do that thing, when I get to just come home after school and then you take me to practice? And it was one of those moments where you just, as a parent, you stop and you say, wow. And I just looked at him. I said, yes, we can. And I changed my schedule. I changed my whole work setup and I made it so that he would not have to go to after school care anymore. And he was actually probably a little bit younger than that. And I took him to practice every day. And that was important to him. And therefore it was important to me. So there was a period of time there, several years, where I definitely stepped back a little bit and made them more of the priority than I had been able to do before. And for my kids, that was critical because they both were athletes. They both ended up going to, Division I schools and being Division I athletes, which is fairly rare. And it requires a commitment from the family as well as the kids because you have to go to tournaments. And, my daughter was an equestrian, so you have to go to horse shows and those are very expensive. And, there's a lot of wealthy families in sports. And I think that's something most people aren't aware of. They know the stories about sort of the famous kids and sort of the kid who comes out of nowhere and has a full ride scholarship. Well, I saw what that looks like up close. And I mean, those kids, they still have a lot of challenges that they have to overcome. I mean, I met kids who didn't have enough to eat, which is terrible. But for us, it just meant that, we had to get our kids in front of the right people. When you knew there was a college coach that was going to be at a horse show or at a lacrosse tournament, we tried to get our kids there. So it would have been difficult to do that if I was still working, 50 hours a week in the office.
Wow.
So it's tough, but those making our kids, allowing our kids to have those opportunities definitely got them in the position to be considered for those types of opportunities. And that meant that, my daughter got 75% of her education paid for by the equestrian team. And my son is at the Air Force Academy, which is, tuition free. And he's working for it for sure, but he's on the lacrosse team there and he's getting a phenomenal education. And honestly, I don't know if that would have happened without lacrosse.
Wow, that is so wonderful. You just dropped some gold nuggets right there. And, I'm not sure if we all caught what you just shared there, but you just shared that you had two Division I athletes. And, as a former Division I walk-on athlete myself, speaking from my experience, that requires good parenting. That requires good character, good discipline building. So kudos to you and your husband for doing a phenomenal job with your children.
Thank you, Roger.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this, how did you balance, right, being a mom, right, sharing your best with them, and then still managing building a very successful business? And did you think that it was important to teach them some of those things about the business? Or what was your opinion on how you educated them on entrepreneurship?
I love that question, and I wish I had a really great answer to it. But unfortunately, neither one of my kids at this point has any interest in business, which makes me laugh. And for a while, I actually had a little store that I took to horse shows because I wanted to learn more about NCAA equestrian because it didn't exist when I was a kid because that was my sport too. And it wasn't a well-known entity in New England because a lot of the schools that are competitive in equestrian are in the South. Auburn, University of Georgia, University of South Carolina, a lot of the, the Big 12 and the SEC schools have equestrian teams, partially to balance out those gigantic football teams because, thanks to Title IX, you have to have as many opportunities for women as you do for men. And equestrian is one way that a school can make up those spots for women because it's a women-only sport.
Oh.
So I took my little store to horse shows, and the horse show vendor world is very competitive. So I had to make sure that I came in with things that not all the other stores had, and I had to sort of play nice with the other vendors. And from my time at Emily Post, I had been exposed to stationery a lot because we did a 3-year stationery program with a company called Design Design. They're in Grand Rapids, Michigan, similar to Hallmark. They make every kind of paper product you could possibly imagine. They're phenomenal people. So I had a lot of really gifty things in my store. I had some Lily Pulitzer stuff, which of course the tweens went crazy for. And of course I had things like, show gloves and hairnets, the things that you needed at a horse show. But I also, during that time period, had several marketing clients. and some in the equestrian space, which was super fun for me. And I just, I had my laptop at the counter and I would be writing content and doing social media posts. And I actually helped a few clients build Shopify websites when Shopify first came out, because at that time in retail, what was happening was manufacturers could see that they had the opportunity to sell online, but the retailers were terrified that that would mean the end of their business. And at Emily Post, we had dealt with that with the stationery stores, because the places that would buy the stationery books, these were all, small businesses, mostly run by women. Your stationery shops, your gift stores, your stores at like the golf country clubs, and they were terrified that if this product goes online, I'll never be able to sell it. And so we crafted a really upscale program for the retailers that gave them a lot of extras. We gave them event kits and taught them how to run really great events. We talked to them about email marketing and how to build an email list so you can stay in touch with your customers. And it is really a way a retailer can distinguish themselves in the market and make themselves, really invaluable to their customers. And that was so successful. So when I got into the equestrian space and I met some of these people who have, and they're all entrepreneurs, a lot of times they're women, and they make a product that is fantastic. They have built up relationships with the retailers, but yet at the same time, there's this fantastic opportunity to be online and sell direct to consumer. And if you're a manufacturer, you have to pursue that path too, because it's hard to be successful otherwise. And that was a point in time where people were just starting to figure that out. And to me, it was, oh, I recognize this. This looks very familiar to something else that I've seen, which is the benefit of age. Who knew there were benefits? And I was able to really kind of come in and say, we can figure this out. We can keep your retailers happy and we can build them something really special. And yes, you can sell direct to consumer so that you're capturing that other, 40% of revenue, and that helps your business be successful.
Wow, that is absolutely phenomenal. I just love how you just gave us a master class on your business and PR. I am just so thrilled. Wow, I am so excited to go back and listen to this. I'm gonna have my notepad. I'm gonna be taking notes. Okay, email marketing list. Okay, who can I put on my email marketing list? I'm absolutely thrilled for this. Just a couple more questions. This has been amazing.
Thank you,
I would
Roger.
love to know what the process was. I'm sure all of our listeners will also love to know, what was the process from shifting to being W-2 employee to taking that leap of faith to step out on your own to then start Howl Media? And what were some of the mindset shifts that helped you to get there?
It's interesting. I think I was fairly unique in the fact that when I first worked at the ad agency in that billable hours environment, one of the aspects of my job that I was responsible for was developing or finding new business. That was completely outside my zone of experience. I was, pretty young at that point, but my boss was very clear. Part of your job is to help us get new business, because if we don't get new business, we won't survive. And I took that. I took him at his word, and I joined groups where there was networking going on, and I was meeting other people in the community. I'd also moved to a brand new place that helped me meet people. So I really took ownership of that, and I took it seriously, and it felt like my own business. It was only 6 people in that ad agency. It was a very small business. So I had that entrepreneurial hat on then. And I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I was getting a paycheck. I knew I was getting a paycheck, so I wasn't completely cutting the cord, but I took ownership over that idea that if I don't produce, we will not be getting paychecks, which is, probably the biggest fear an entrepreneur has. And then when I worked at Emily Post, it was a similar situation, because for the first 4 or 5 years, it was just me and Peggy. And every new deal that we got was a huge celebration. We ended up negotiating a weekly column in the New York Times where we wrote about wedding etiquette. We had a weekly column in the Boston Globe where we wrote about business etiquette. We had a parenting etiquette column in Parents Magazine. Each deal that we were able to secure was more of a financial safety net for the business. And I knew that, and that was super important. We had a situation happen where when you have books, you get royalty checks twice a year when you work with a traditional publisher. We worked with HarperCollins. And one year we got advance warning that our royalty check was going to be $75,000 less than what we had anticipated. And that was probably 3 or 4 months of payroll. So that was very upsetting, to say the least. And I went into action mode and tried to pitch my authors. At that point, I had 2 authors I could work with, but pitched them to morning shows, came up with different topics of things we could talk about that were really timely and newsworthy. And fortunately, in my topic area of etiquette and manners, you could read the front page of the newspaper and there would be something tied to manners. You just had to kind of be creative about it. So I leaned on my relationships with morning show producers to try to get more interviews and more appearances. And because I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I knew something would happen because those types of interviews always led to some other kind of opportunity. And fortunately, we were able to secure some corporate spokesperson campaigns where a company would come to us, and it would usually be their PR agency out of New York or LA that would call us, and they would want to do a campaign and use a Post author as the spokesperson. And then we would negotiate a contract. And fortunately, not long after that phone call from HarperCollins, we got a 6-figure spokesperson deal that came through from those interviews that we had done. And that saved us.
Wow, that's absolutely phenomenal. I mean, and for our listeners out there, it goes without saying, those are some major names that you mentioned: Boston Globe, New York Times, Parent Magazine, and you brought that into what you do now at Howell Media. That's absolutely phenomenal. That is exciting. Wow. Thank you so much for being here today. There's a couple of questions I want to ask you, and these are going to be kind of like quick rapid fire questions. But I think that they really add a lot of value to our listeners out there because, as a mindset person myself, someone who teaches leadership, I really understand that it has a lot to do with how you're speaking to yourself. What's the narrative that you're repeating to yourself over and over again? And with that being said, I would love to hear from you. What is one piece of media, whether it was an audio piece of media or whether it was a book or something else, nonfiction, by the way, that has truly impacted you in your journey to becoming successfully unemployed?
That's a great question, Roger. And thank you so much for all the kind things that you've said. So great. And the mindset piece, that is so important. You're so right. And I am definitely someone who has been guilty of negative self-talk. So I appreciate that that's something that you're really good at. And it's something that we all need, to be reminded. And, there's that book about the love languages. And I read that book a long time ago, but it made me realize that my love language is words of praise. And it's because I didn't get a lot as a kid or even, as an adult. But I would say that I always really believed that you can do whatever you set your mind to and that you just have to go out and do it. But when in about 2014, I started listening to Amy Porterfield, and she was one of the first women to really have a very successful business-oriented podcast. And she was someone who worked at Tony Robbins, which was, and I felt was a company that was very similar to Emily Post in the respect that, what are you trying to do there? You're monetizing content. Now with Tony Robbins, obviously you've got a lot to work with there, which is great.
Yes.
But Amy had done a job that was similar to mine, where she was traveling across the country and the world, with Tony and helping him set up events and, really helping him monetize his content when you think about it. And so her going out on her own and her mission was to help other people develop their own online businesses. And for her, that's through teaching people how to create their own digital courses. And she did that through a digital course. So I also kind of appreciated the meta aspect of what she was doing, because that was kind of how I had started out at CNN. But every week I listened to her, she would be drilling down on something specific. Like she talked about leap, and she was one of the really first people out there who started talking about how important it is to own your own way to connect with your audience. And so she was, beating that email drum 10, 12 years ago. And most people did not even make that connection until everybody heard these horror stories about people losing their entire business because their Facebook account got shut off, and how people fell into this Facebook situation where they were paying for ads. And if they spent $10,000 on ads, they were able to make $20,000 until Facebook kicked them off, and then they had no way to get in front of their audience. And so she was teaching very strategic lessons, very specific action steps, and I ate that up. And that was a huge factor in me building my business and thinking about, how do I want to serve people, and how do I help them build a business that is well structured, safe, that gives them the tools that they need to get the success that they want.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. That is so awesome. I'm going to go listen to Amy Porterfield when we wrap this up, see if she has a podcast that I can listen to. Let me tell you. Another question for you. How has failure shaped your life?
Oh, goodness. Failure is painful, but it's part of what we do, And I would say that, again, like you experience it, if you're doing PR, you're experiencing it every day. You're not going to get 10 yes. If you pitch the Today Show, Good Morning America, and CBS This Morning, they're not all going to say yes. And even in the best case scenario, they're also not going to all three have you on. So if you get, one, you're not going to get the other two. So, and if you're type A, which I am, on some level, you're going to perceive that as failure. But I would say I was really fortunate when I worked at Emily Post. We, at one point, had done some sales training, and I had never done anything like that before. And the sales trainer that we had, Stacia Skinner, she was amazing. And she took us through a bunch of exercises. And one of the things that she did was she had this paper that had 100 check boxes in it. And she told us that insurance companies use that to train their new sales employees, and that every checkbox was a no. And when they had 100 no's, they got a bonus. And they did that because getting a no, perceived as failure, can be so, upsetting that a lot of people would quit before they ever got to their 100th no. And the statistics that they had showed that once you got past your 100 no's, it was more than likely you were going to get a yes. So they did that to reinforce that message. So those are the kinds of things that helped me get past the idea of like what failure is. And I also, I am determined and probably a little stubborn maybe. And if something isn't working, if I have a failure, I just try a different way.
Wow, that is absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I could not agree with that concept more. There's a book out there called Go for No. And really the concept is changing how you perceive what the stimulus is. The stimulus now becomes granted when you get the no. So when you get the yes, it's like, oh, no, yes, wow. It's like you just keep going. You're expecting the no. Okay,
Yes.
boom, here comes no. Then all of a sudden, yes comes as a result. Because, I've heard someone say there's never one side to anything. There's not a one-sided piece of paper. There's not a one-sided pancake. There's always two sides. And on the other side of failure is success if you keep going. The opposite of success is not failure. The opposite of success is quitting. And as long as you don't stop and persist in a worthy endeavor that adds value to the marketplace, even if it's new to you, if you continue to persevere, then you will find that value. You will find that success in due time. So
I agree.
Elizabeth, this has been absolutely phenomenal. Can I please ask you one last important question?
Of course.
Where can people find you? How can they work with you? How can they leverage your expertise? Where are you out there in the world? How can they get in touch with you?
I would love to work with any of your listeners, Roger, and they can reach me. Probably the easiest place is LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. It's just Elizabeth Howell, UELL. They're free to send me a DM, or you can even just schedule a meeting with me. I have a calendar link right at the top.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much. Elizabeth Howell of Howell Media. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Roger. This
Yes.
was so much fun.
This was a pleasure. Pleasure was all mine.
Thank you.